Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. I went to Hamilton, Missouri in September of 2024 and attended Birthday Bash. I received a swag bag and some other gifts at various events I attended, and also vendors were set up and offering freebies to people who visited their tents. And here is a look at all the mini charm packs that I received. I've never used these mini charm packs before, and I decided I'm going to sew them all into half square triangles. Before I get started, I'm going to put this diagonal seam tape on my sewing machine so I've got a nice line for my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I had these nice tan colors and then these pretty muted blues, and I thought, well, I'll put those together as a group. Then I also had a pack of Kona White and some brights, and I was going to put those together, and anything left over was just going to get put together however it worked out. To use this diagonal seam tape, what I'm doing is lining up the center of my diamond shape on the 1/4 inch line. That way my seam, which is the red line, is going to be a 1/4 inch over from the center. And then I'm going to stitch down both sides and then cut these apart, and I will have 2 half square triangles. I noticed these blue packs did have some tan colors in them, so I pulled those out because I don't think those are going to work. It'll be not enough contrast between the tans that I'm using for background fabric and the tans that are in that blue set. And again, using that diagonal seam tape, I'm trying to keep the points of my diamond on the black line, which is the 1/4 inch line, and that way the red line, which is the seam line, will be a 1/4 inch seam. The only thing I can compare to this is when I made 800 not half square triangles, I made 800 hourglass blocks. Of course, first I had to make that many half square triangles and then put them together to make the hourglass blocks. But this, I'm just sitting down and making half square triangles all day long. I'm not really having to think too much because I've got these packs of the tans, I've got the blues all separated out, and I can just sit at the machine and sew, sew, sew. Once I got to the end of this first group, I flipped this entire chain around and sewed down the other side of my center. It's kind of fun to separate these chains with my little blade saver device. Well, with that first batch done with the tans and the blues, I decided to start on these bright packs. I had 2 really bright packs that are the same with these beautiful purples and blues, rainbow colors. And then I also had a pack of white that was a double. So there were 84 pieces in this white pack. So I just logically said I'll pair the 84 whites up with these brights, and then we'll worry about what to do with the rest of them later. with the last packs, I just matched up lights and darks as best as I could. I went ahead and separated my chain after the first round, and then I stitched back down the opposite side. With the second batch all stitched up, it's time to cut them in half. If I'm just making a small number of half square triangles, I use my scissors to cut on that line between the two halves. I have so many here, I think using my scissors that many times in a row would really tire out my wrist. So I'm using a ruler and my blade, my rotary cutter, to cut the units apart. As I went on, I realized how many there were and that it was going to take me so long, so I started trying to find a more efficient way. And you can see what I'm doing here. I'm laying out several at a time and cutting them all. That seemed to work pretty well. Well, there are a lot of different ways to square up a block. These blocks are going to be squared to 2 inches. My tried and true method is just using my favorite ruler, which has a diagonal line on it. I line that diagonal line up with my ruler line with the seam line. Then I trim the top side and the right hand side. Then I can flip my little unit around the opposite way. Again, I line up that diagonal line, and then I get the measurements on the left and the bottom to the 2 inch where I want it, and trim off the other 2 sides. I also have some of these Clearly Perfect slotted trimmers. They have the little slots in them, and I can use this to trim to a 2 inch size. So you want to do that before you press them. So I'm lining up the 2 inch line on the ruler with my seam line on the block before I press it open, and I only have to trim 2 sides. And also it has these notches, but I have to use a different rotary cutter, not my favorite one. That Fons and Porter will not work in those slots, so I pull out my Olfa and use that for the slots. And now this little unit is ready to press flat. Another option is to use that clearly slotted trimmer to trim the 2 sides, and then trim off your notches after you take it out from under the ruler if you don't have that kind of a cutter that will fit into that slot. And trying to be as efficient as possible because there were so many. I tried various ways of laying these out on my mat and doing more than one at a time. I just kept going and going and trying different ways until I was all done. Now I did want to show you one more way to use just a regular ruler to trim these. I've got 2 inch lines on my ruler, and I know I want a 2 inch block. I'm going to line the 2 inch line on the right side of my seam and get that 2 inch line on the left side of my ruler on the left side of my seam. And that is also going to give me a 2 inch block by trimming off those 2 sides. And then I will trim those notches. Let's do that one more time. You can see I've got the 2 inch mark on my ruler on the right and the left of the seam. Then I'm just going to trim the 2 sides, and then I will trim off those notches. Well, that was a lot of work making all these half square triangles. Now it's time to press them flat. When I have a repetitive project like this, as you could see with my cutting, same way with my pressing, I try to find the most efficient way to get a whole lot done with the least amount of work on my part. It's kind of a fun little challenge to see if you can figure out a better and faster way to do something. I did spend some time sorting these into general color families. I wanted to try and make some cohesive blocks. So I got them sorted out into some reds and pinks. All the blues went into one stack, the greens, then those brights went into another stack. I looked through my Barbara Brackman encyclopedia for a pattern that was heavy on half square triangles. I found this one called the Square Deal from the Kansas City Star, and I thought that would be just perfect. I would try to make blocks based on color families. I also spent some time taking darks and lights into consideration because I wanted to keep darks in one block, mediums in one block, lights in a different block. I started laying out my blocks, and once I got one block laid out, I started on another block right on top of the first one. If I was going to do this again, I would probably lay out one block at a time. There's just so many pieces, and I did run into an issue where one stack got an extra, one stack didn't have enough, so I had to go back through everything all over again and resort it out and relay it out. So like I said, maybe in this one that has so many pieces, maybe you just do one block at a time. Well, I started putting squares together, and that's really all you can do. Each of these rows has a total of 8 little squares, and there are 8 rows, so each block has 64 pieces to put together. It's really just a matter of hunkering down, putting on a good movie or an audiobook or some relaxing music, and just taking your time, take it slowly, make sure you're getting the right pieces together. Once I had each of the rows assembled, I could take 2 rows and put them together. I didn't worry about using clips or pins. These units are pretty small, so it was not too hard to nest the seams as I went along. You'll notice that these seams seem to bow a little bit. They have that curve to them. I am making sure and stitching these seams together in opposite directions each time, so that's something you may want to think about doing. Well, you can see I put 2 rows together with 2 other rows until the block was complete. These blocks that I trimmed the half square triangles to 2 inches each, they make about a 12.5-inch block, which will finish to 12. Here's where I laid everything out all over again because I was off on a couple of stacks. Next, I just started sewing 2 units together with 2 other units and worked my way through these blocks. and I decided to chain piece it all. I decided I wasn't going to try and refigure it out. If I ran across a mistake, I would just fix it on the fly. It was a pretty good feeling as I started approaching the end of this process and started getting actual blocks together. There were a couple of mistakes in this quilt, a couple where the little squares were turned around the wrong way. I really didn't worry too much about that. I fixed one that I did find and flipped around a row that was put on the wrong way. But overall, I really loved the way these blocks turned out. Once I got them all stitched together, I pressed them nice and flat. All of those little mini charm squares that I used, I was able to make 10 blocks. To do the layout I wanted to do, I added 2 orphan blocks from my stash. They have a little unicorn on them. I just made them using scraps and bias. And here is the layout. I'm going to add some sashing and some borders next. I wanted something a little neutral. I had this roll in my stash of grays, so I'm going to start with that and make some rows and use this gray as sashing. Starting out, I'm taking one of my blocks and I'm going to put the sashing right sides together and stitch that 1/4 inch seam. I trimmed the sashing to the right length as I went along. If you want to keep a close eye on preserving your points, you can put this fabric right sides together with the sashing, but put the sashing down underneath. Then when you stitch, you're going to see that little triangle point. And if you make sure your needle doesn't go over that little point, you will preserve the point. Next, I started assembling my rows by putting 2 of these units together. I went ahead and added the 3rd block to each row, one at a time, just to keep everything straight. So adding this 3rd block, that completes my 1st row. Once I finished putting all the rows together and the sashing, I laid it down on the ground and took a look, and I decided I did want to put a border on this. Since I had opened up that brand new roll of 2.5 inch strips, I wanted to use them. In addition, I went to my stash and I had a few Christmas strips, 2.5 inch strips. I had 4 of them and I thought they would fit in well with this color scheme, so I cleared out some extra from my stash. Now what you see me doing here is sewing 2.5 inch strips to other 2.5 inch strips, and I did kind of separate them a little bit and try and get different colors so I wouldn't have 2 colors right next to each other. And again, to avoid bowing, I flipped all these strips the opposite way for the 2nd round. Once I had all the strips together, I pressed them nice and flat. Next, I trimmed these strips the opposite way of the seams to make a piano key border, and I'm going to make them 5 inches wide. You'll get a nice straight cut by using the horizontal lines on your ruler, matching those up to horizontal seam lines. After measuring how much border I needed to go all the way around the quilt, I ended up cutting some of my strips in half to make a 2.5-inch wide border, and that way I had enough to border the whole quilt, and you will see that in just a bit here. I already added the 5-inch border to the long sides of the quilt, and here you see I'm adding that 2.5-inch border to the top and the bottom of the quilt. I was successful in using up most of those 2.5-inch strips. This is all I have left to go into my scrap bin. And here we have a look at that final finished quilt. I'll leave the measurements in the description. I think it turned out really cute. I do love that piano key border. I also love those quirky orphan unicorn blocks. Some kid is really going to love this, and that kid is not going to know how much work it was to make all these half square triangles, but that's okay. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you back again real soon.